Good morning. Ain Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1269. And we're in the middle of discussing the Rishimu. So going over and reviewing the exact language, I want to emphasize a few points and clarifications that I noticed when I read it again. Initially, most people, when they hear the word Rishima, and I've said this already, the first reaction is that something existed, then a Tzimtzum came, so to speak, erased it or concealed it or covered up, and yet some residue, some impression remained. It's becoming clear here that that's not how he's interpreting Rishimu. Rishimu is actually a force that was there before the Tzimtzum, because when you say residue, when you say, like you erase, let's say, something on paper and something remains, that what remains is only a small reflection of what was there before. When we're saying here that Rishimu is the Koyach HaGvul, like he says, it was there in Ain Beis Kedem HaTzimtzum, so the Koyach HaGvul is much more than just a remnant from something that was there. It was a Koyach HaGvul, but it was completely concealed. So when he said in the last paragraph on page 1269, these words, that struck me, and I said at the time that we're going to need to explain what it is, but I think it's becoming apparent now what he means by that. Because in contrast to the Rishimu, the Reshim, in Akudim, which is the distinction he made, there the radiated, the then withdrew, it left a Reshim, some impression, which that Reshim was also included in the before, but it was like the particles, but it wasn't apparent. Now it's apparent, and now it can develop and becomes, like he says, B'chinas Ivius Yeser. So there, the entire Reshim is only a result of the concealment. There'd be no concealment, there'd be no Reshim. When he talks about the Rishimu, we're learning it's different. He says it's not Einikein. The Etzma Rishima B'chinas Koyach HaGvul, the Etzma Rishima has an identity, so to speak, outside of the Tzimtzum. Its identity is the Koyach HaGvul, the letters that were there before the Tzimtzum. When you talk about a Rishimu, like in the context of the particles that are there in the before, in the Akudim, they don't have an identity of their own. And when do they become an identity? When the Tzimtzum happens. As we're going to read in a few lines, he's going to say very explicitly that so by the Akudim, the Reshim is a result of the removing itself and leaving an impression. With the Rishimu, the removing itself causes the Rishimu to be a force, but the force is already there before us, the Koyach HaGvul of Ein Sof, which is a key difference and a key element, as we're going to learn further. I just wanted to make this point because it may not have been so clear when we discussed it. But we're going to read it inside again. So we're summing up now. He's continuing to develop the idea that the Rishima has a very different type of a modus operandi, so to speak, a different track than the Kav. We're going to get back to the Kav, the Eiris. The whole point of this, of course, is to come to explain the power, the potency and power of the Kalim, because that was his question back on the bottom of page 1266 and top of 1267, that at the end of the day, how do we actually reach this highest levels of Atzmus when we're still working within the realm of Kalim and structure and so on? Even though Simcha Shel Mitzvah and the B'chol Moedecha and the Mesiras Nefesh, everything he said is all in place, but still, he wants to have that final picture of what these Kalim really accomplish. So it's besides being Kalim that reveal Eir, they themselves are going to reveal, ultimately, they're going to express a divine power that's even higher than Eir itself, from the Etzem itself. So far what we've learned is that the Eir is rooted in Ein Sof, but not Atzmus Mahus Ein Sof. Ein Sof, you can apply also to Eir because it could have a beginning, it could have a source, and yet it's Ein Sof also in quantity and in quality, whereas the Rishima comes from a higher place than that. In the language, Aleis HaRatzon is where Eir comes from, where arose in his desire before the Tzimtzum, which is like the 10 hidden spheres, and the Rishima comes from Kaidam Aleis HaRatzon, what he called Hayahu Shmoi, Bilvat Shmoi. That was what he said earlier. I'm just summing up what we learned the last few pages. He also distinguished between Chitzenia Sa'er and the Pnimius of the Chitzenia Sa'er, as in the synergy that is more than the sum of the parts of the letters of the 10 hidden spheres. And then there's a level that's even higher than that, Pnimius Sa'er. And the Rishim again associates with Pnimius Sa'er, whereas the Eir itself is either the Chitzenius or the Chitzenius Sa'er or the Pnimius of the Chitzenius. That was on the bottom of page 1268 and top of 1269. And one more thing I wanted to say about this. Second. And overall, the Rishimu is, as he said, a Reshim from the Eir HaKodim. It encompasses in it, in the concealed state, everything that was there before the Tzimtzum, which is part of what we're in the middle of discussing now. Yeah. So now, in the paragraph that we've been learning, the second paragraph on 1269, so he says that the Rishim has two things: the Etzem Nekudus HaRishimu and the Eir Ein Sof Shabbat, which is concealed within it. So it's like the very Etzem Nekudus HaRishimu, he calls that the Koyach HaGvul, the power of Gvul, of Ein Sof. And then Kshoya Tzimtzum, and the Tzimtzum came along. Nisha Reishim Ein Sof b'Nekudus HaRishimu. A Reishim of the Ein Sof remained in the Nekudah of the Rishimu. Shenisal Ma'er al Dei Nekudus HaRishimu. That the Eir was concealed through the Nekudus HaRishimu. In other words, it's not the Eir is concealed through the Tzimtzum, it's through the Nekudus HaRishimu. And that's where he makes the distinction. And Eitz Chaim, it's not like the formation of the containers, of the container in Akudim. In Eitz Chaim, he says that there's a Reishim. That Reishim is a result of the Helam HaTzimtzum, of the concealment of the light. Whereas, I'm just going back to what we read. When the Kudish HaRishim, the Ein Sof Einer came. The Etzem HaRishim and the B'chinas Koyach HaGvul Haya Be'er Ein Sof Koydem HaTzimtzum. The Koyach HaGvul was there before the Tzimtzum. You don't say that in Akudim. That there was a power there before. You say that the Eir included in it some thickness, and then when it was concealed, it emerged, and then it developed further into a container. So the Kodesh, so the Koyach HaGvul was there. Nothing new was created. So when the Rishimu came, it emerges after the Tzimtzum, it's not a creation of a new Keli. It was all there before. Whereas in Akudim, it's a creation of a Keli. There was no Keli before. The energies were there. The energies receded. They left an impression. And that impression began to develop into an entity called a Keli. Just like it is with a child. That there's that first you have one cell. I'm sorry, a child is a newborn entity. You can't say that before conception, the child was there, concealed. No, it wasn't there. When the seed and the egg joined and God sent a soul into it, a cell developed, and that cell would then split and turn into a child, a fetus. The Rishima, on the other hand, is not a creation. The Rishima was there before the Tzimtzum Koyach HaGvul. It was encompassed in it all, and you couldn't see it, so to speak. But it was there, and nothing new was created. So that's the distinction. The second distinction is that it's not a result of the tzimtzum, it's a result of its own entity, which we're going to learn in a moment. So you'll see in a second what I just said. So why the Rishim is not a new thing? So why wasn't it there? Why didn't we see it before the Tzimtzum? He says, because Kedem at Tzimtzum, the Ein Sof HaBligvul, the all-encompassing Bligvul energy, caused that Lo Yoya Niked, it was not discernible beforehand the Rishim. And then he adds, I'll just elaborate a bit more the parentheses, V'agilu hoya the esis harishima. So Nikim Mekedem harishima, right? The Keich HaGvul was not recognizable. And the Gilu of Ein Sof, radiated through the esis, but the esis were not discernible. Like the example being that when you're very intensely involved in thought, you discern the letters that you're using to think, because the energy of the thought is most intense. When you're speaking, when you're writing, then the letters become discernible and tangible. But when they're completely absorbed in thought, these letters are not discernible. Okay. And then when the tzimtzum happened, so I'm on the way down on page 1269. The line and then when the tzimtzum happened, Nasi is Gabrus de Keich HaGvul Sheba Ein Sof. So important to point out. So the tzimtzum on one hand concealed the Eir HaBligvul, but there's a second thing that happened. Once the Eir HaBligvul, so-called that energy flow, that infinite energy flow, so-called receded, Kavyachol, what happens? The Keich HaGvul now becomes intensified. It would be like I said before about letters. If a light is shining so powerfully, you don't even see the letters, even though they're there, then if you remove the light, what happens? The letters suddenly emerge. You suddenly have these letters. Now, the letters don't have light in them. There's no gili, but you can talk about something called letters, or what he calls the Keich HaGvul. So when the Keich HaGvul of Ein Sof was before the Tzimtzum, it was completely absorbed, like the example I gave, like imagine something submerged underwater. You can't see it. The water recedes, and that element begins to what's the word I want to say? Intensifies. Is Gabrus the Keich HaGvul Sheba Ein Sof. Okay, so then comes the question: so why do you call it Rishimu? It seems like a very misleading name. If you said it's a impression from something that was before, like it is with Akudim, that the Reshim is an impression that's left over, that the Eir leaves and it leaves some type of shadow, so to speak, or something that they can then build. So that makes sense. That's a Reshim. Now you're telling me the Reshima was completely intact before the Tzimtzum, and nothing was renewed. Nothing, Leinis Chadash Shum Dover, or Leinis Chadash B'Zeh Dover. It was the Keich HaGvul. So why do we call it Reshima? So he says, U'mashanikra b'shem Reshimu. Why is it called in the name of Rishimu, which means impression? Impression, residue, trace. He says, because in general, Bechinas Keich HaGvul, the power of the finite, it's as if it's like, comparatively speaking, if you put Gvul and Bligvul near each other, the Gvul is like a Reshim, meaning it's minuscule. It's like it's as if it's like not a Reshim as in a trace, but compared to Bligvul, it's called a Reshim. It's only a Reshim. I believe this goes all the way back to the Alter Rebbe, if I recall correctly. So we see from this that the Rishimu has another aspect to it, which is not a trace or an impression. That's actually the Keich HaGvul that was there and now is emerged. But it's still concealed because that's its whole entity. It's a concealed state. Now, this does not contradict that the Rishimu could also be a trace, because we do know, as I explained when I gave the class in the Kollel, and also in my life, that the Rishimu, there are 4 examples that the Mittler Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab give for Rishimu. And the Alter Rebbe, actually. One is like a kitzer, like a summary. The second is like a map that someone traces. Number three, like a siman, a sign, and a remez, a hint. So all of them indicate much more a different dimension of the Rishima, but that's not a contradiction because remember, the Rishima has several aspects to it. One is the etzem nekudas Rishima is what we're talking about here, and then we're talking about how the Ein stuff is in there, and there that is. Remember, the Rishima has a second aspect, which is it includes within it the trace of also the Er HaBligvul, not just the Koyach HaGvul. So the Koyach HaGvul is not separate. Within it, it carries a reminder. And like I said yesterday or the other day about like the vapor or something that remains after the explosion, the Rishima has that as well in it. Like he said on top of the page. Because if not, you can't call it a Reshima Er HaKodim. So you see clearly he's also using the word Reshim in the context of an impression of what was there before. So there's both these elements to it. So you see, it gets quite intricate and complex as we break it down. But let's continue. Let's see what he says next now. I will stop in case anybody wants me to clarify any point there, even though we're in the middle of the subject, and I know everyone wants to see how it ends, but just in case something I said that needs clarification, if you want to ask anything, please. Okay. So now we explained the word Reshim. Now we continue the next line. So now you see he's now using the word Reshim on the context of the Ein Sof HaBligvul, not just Koyach HaGvul compared to Bligvul, but also the Ein Sof HaBligvul that receded and allowed the Koyach HaGvul to emerge. This Gabus Koyach HaGvul, he says there's a Reshim of that is Nichl b'Nekudas HaReshima. So in the Nekud of the Reshima that we have now the second thing that he said. Remember on the top of the page, top of the paragraph rather, he said there's two inyanim. Etzem Nekudas HaReshima we just addressed. That's the Koyach HaGvul. And V'Ein Sof Sheba. And the Ein Sof within it, that's what he's saying. Reshim Ein Sof HaBligvul Nichl b'Nekudas HaReshima. It's encompassed in there, not in a revealed way. It's in a potential state, in a what we say a latent state, but it's in there. Why is this so critical? Why can't you say that Ein Sof HaBligvul remains outside of pre-Tzimtzum and that's that? Because first of all, we want to have as much as possible of godliness also post-Tzimtzum. Second of all, because Eibishter is only one God, so even though his manifestation, his revelation comes into two tracks, Er HaGvul and Er HaBligvul, the truth is they both originate from the same one source. So really, even though Gvul and Bligvul in our eyes are two tracks, finite and infinite, but remember, from the Eibishter's point of view, from God's point of view, from God's point of view, they're really just two expressions of his yichelis, of his capacity. So in a way, just like before the Tzimtzum, the Er HaBligvul encompassed in it the Gvul, Koyach HaGvul. So after the Tzimtzum, the Koyach HaGvul encompasses in it the Bligvul. However, it's in a concealed state. The difference is Bligvul is expansive and revealing, like Oyer, and Koyach HaGvul is concentrated and concealing. But it doesn't mean it doesn't have the potency of Ein Sof in it. So the Reshima basically has both elements. It's the Koyach HaGvul, and it has that potency of the Ein Sof, the Reshim of it in it. Okay, now he says like this. Look at this on. And now, because after the Tzimtzum, there's Gabrus, the intensification of the power of Gvul, which before the Tzimtzum it was subdued or it was completely obfuscated. This alam ba b'chinas Ein Sof HaBligvul. And it is concealed the Ein Sof HaBligvul. So literally, just as it was before the Tzimtzum, the Bligvul dominated, infinity, the infinite expanse of divine, all-encompassing divine dominated, and the gvul was concealed within it, because the Eibishter has the power both to create the infinite and the finite. Think of it this way, that there's infinite possibilities the artist can create infinite possibilities of art. That includes also one art called Eses Viris Agnuzis. So the one type of art that he's going to create is also part of his Bli Gvul. In the first volume in Ain Beis, this was a very big theme where he said that the Oyer HaGvul of the 10 hidden spheres is really just a piece of the Oyer HaBli Gvul. However, before the Tzimtzum, like we said, you look at the artist, before he creates one piece of art, that one piece of art is encompassed b'koyach within all the parts, within all his infinite possibilities, and frankly, even higher than that, but there's levels that are higher than the spheres. Sphere of Saint Ketz. After the Tzimtzum, everything's reversed. Now the artist is focusing on creating one piece of art. We're not talking about yet the kav, so you don't actually have art. But he's now so-called concealed and receded all his infinite possibilities. Now what you have is a reshima, the koyach hagvul, the power to create one piece of art, which is going to be the actual 10 spheres. In it is encompassed also all his infinite possibilities. Like we learned before with the teacher and the student. When the teacher is applying himself to the student, so then he has to reveal only what he's teaching him. But within the teacher lies all the wisdom that he has, even though he's not expressing it. So the kav is focused on one thing. The Rishimu has in it the koyach hagvul, the power to restrain and conceal and limit the flow. That's the koyach hagvul, the power of restraint, which is also the power of concealment. In it lies all the infinity of God. However, it's concentrated in a completely concealed way, in a latent form. So again, now that there's the focus on the koyach hagvul, the intensification of the koyach hagvul, within it is concealed the Eidin Sefer HaBli. To put it in very balabatisha Asius, that when you look at a piece of like a tree or a bird or a piece of this world, I'm not talking now about the earth. We're just talking about the very kelim that God created in this world. So even though you only see the tree, within it lies all the Ein Sof of godliness. Yes, to see infinity in a grain of sand, and eternity in an hour, which comes from William Blake, but they say that he has studied mysticism, including Jewish mysticism. The idea of the infinite within the finite is essentially what he's saying here. But because it's finite, that's what dominates, it's concealed. But it's there. Now, in the root of the kelim, remember, we don't have actual kelim yet. The reshima is the root of the kelim. It makes total sense because in the root of the kelim, the reshima has a reshima of everything that was there before the tzimtzum. And at the same time, you have the actual reshima, is koyach hagvul, a concentrated, concealed state. V'gam, he says in the parentheses, v'gam nasa b'chinas mitzias canal. Another thing that happens with the reshima, besides that the power of the finite is the dominant force now, and within it is concealed the infinite, it also gives some substance begins to be addressed here. Because remember, at the end of the last paragraph, he said that when Ur is concealed, Mitzias emerges. So even though you can't talk about the Reshima as an actual entity because it's completely concealed, but it's created the potential for Mitzias, which is why it will become the root of the containers. So he says, what you said, if you look at the 3 lines tonight, so Mitzias, you could do a klal, the Helam Ha'er Gorim Inyan HaMitzias. Okay. We call Zeh, and all that we just discussed, which is both the power of Gvul of the Nekudas Harishim and the Erein Sof that's concealed in it, Kol Zeh Mepnei Nekudas Harishimu, is all due to the Nekudas Harishimu itself. Because the Rishima is a power of the divine. it's not just a leftover. It's not just a residue of something else. It itself is a power of Elikus. It's called the koyach hagvul of the Eibishter. This is vital in the context of transformation of the Tzimtzum. Because remember, we learned in the beginning of this third volume, we talked about V'yadaitayim v'shavesel levavecha ki havayu elikim shamayim emal v'oros b'tachas einoid. He said, we're looking now not just that the Kalim, Elikim should reveal Havaya, but that we should see the divine within the Kalim themselves, within the darkness itself, within the Rishima itself. Not just that the Rishima is revealing the divine. That Asius, you know what? After the Tzimtzum, the Asius, the light was concealed. So when you read the letters, you don't understand what they're saying. And the kavanah is that the Asius should once again be channels of Gilui and revelation. No, we're talking about the very Asius themselves. God's power to create the finite, God's power to conceal, that itself is going to become revealed in the future. Well, say the word reveal, will be expressing the very divine essence that we're going to be learning, and we are learning, is even deeper than revelation itself, than Eir itself. That's why he's making such a focus, so he's emphasizing so much that it's all coming from the Nekudas of the Shima itself. Yes, that Tzimtzum is necessary because you need the Eir HaBligvul to recede, so the Shima can do its thing. But it's not that the power of it, but the Rishima is not just the absence of light. That was what I was looking to say. It is a force of its own. However, it's a force not of light. It's a force of concealment, a force of gvul. He says here explicitly, not because of the siluk, the removal, and the distance of the air. Where did we see those lines? In the Eitz Chaim about Akudim. If you go back there, he says, the light, as it recedes and it's removed and distant, causes that the Reshim becomes thicker and thicker and allows it and becomes developed into a keli. Here he says it's not due to the silik v'richa ka'er, because the Reshima was there before the Tzimtzum, except it was concealed. And it is an entity of its own. So it's not a result of just the absence of light. And now he says the statement, this is the Chiddush of the Rebbe Marash, that we've mentioned many times, but now he says, because the Eir that's encompassed in the Rishimu, loy noga b'hat Tzimtzum. Okay. So now he's adding, well, he's not adding, he says it's because that the oil that encompasses the shimmer, the tzimtzum did not affect that oil. The im leikein ein zereshima edin abligvul. Because if it did affect, or if you say the im leikein, if you don't say it didn't affect, then it's not a reshim from the edin abligvul. Because if the tzimtzum indeed diminished, or in some way impacted this latent energy within the Rishimu, then you can't say lo nog about Tzimtzum. No, I'm sorry. I didn't phrase it right. If it did affect it, in other words, nog about Tzimtzum, then you can't say it's a reshim from Enes of Ablikvul. It's not, because that was diminished or that was concealed. Well, concealed is not the right word, because it affected it. So we're saying that the Erein Sof, that everything that was there before the Tzimtzum is in the Rishimu, however, it's concealed. This is the famous Teira Er in Noach. Vehisofa, Bedibra Teira Er, Vehisofa, Bedibra Maskal Hein Am Echad. In the Maimer Hein Am Echad, I'm not sure what he means by Hisofa. He probably means the Hisofa of the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Marash on that Maimer. Bahagah. Yeah, Beisofa Bahagah. There's a Hagah there, which I'm going to go over in a moment. And he discusses as well in Matzazu Tafresh Mem from the Rebbe Marash. And is explained elsewhere. So I need to step back and explain what this means to understand what he's saying here. In the context of Rishimu in Torah Eir, this Maimer, the Alter Rebbe says that the Rishimu has something the Kav does not have. It's Keilelas HaKoil. That's the language of the Alter Rebbe. The Rishimu encompasses everything. The Kav, on the other hand, is tailored and very specific to each particular entity that it energizes. Whether it's Chochmah, Bina. The Rishimu Keilelas HaKoil. That's the word. Says that Tzemach Tzedek, he writes a gloss, a note, in Torah Eir, v'tzarachin. This needs explanation. Why? Because everywhere we explains that the Kav is higher than the Rishimu. And here suddenly the Alter Rebbe is saying the Rishimu encompasses it all. And the Kav is only specific levels, level by level. It's like, in other words, so the Rebbe Marash comes, so we're talking in order here. The Tzemach Tzedek writes this note on the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, does not answer it. The Rebbe Marash comes the next generation and writes another note on the Tzemach Tzedek's note, and he answers it. He says, yes, Shlomo, you can say, because the Eisis said, Tzimtzum. So the Alter Rebbe, when he's saying Kalelas HaKoil, it means, he's saying literally, when you say Rishimu, means it's a Rishimu, a trace, or somewhat of a capturing everything that was there before the Tzimtzum. That would mean to say that the Tzimtzum did not affect the Rishimu, and it did affect the Kav. That we know. The Kav is a thin line as a result of the Tzimtzum. The Rishimu is as I mentioned, I don't say a relic, but it's literally a transplant of pre-Tzimtzum reality in a concentrated form in a Nekudas HaRishimu. So it's Keilelas HaKoil. Now, the Rebbe Marash's cousin, Rav Shlomo Zalman, who was a son, I'm not cousin, his nephew, I'm sorry. The Rebbe Marash had brothers, 7 brothers. He was the 7th brother, and one of the brothers was called the Mariel, Abihuda Leib. When the Tzemach Tzedek passed away, the Tzemach Tzedek designated that the Rebbe Marash should be the next Chabad Rebbe, but each of the sons also were called Admur, and they all went to different cities, and they became Rebbes in their cities. One of them was Mariel, went to Kopust. It was a city in Russia, but he passed away within a year from the Tzemach Tzedek, so he really didn't have a long tenure. His son, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman, took over after he passed away. He was called the Kopuster Rebbe, and he wrote famous books. He's known by the name Baal Mogen Ovis. He wrote a series of Chassidus Shesvarim on Chumash, on the Chamisha Chumash Torah. It's called Mogen Ovis. When he saw this note from his uncle, the Rebbe Marash, and there was tensions between them, shall we say, he criticized, he says, not correct. Everywhere in Kabbalah, and everywhere, according to the Alter Rebbe Chassidus, as he understood it, the Rishimu, the whole idea of a Rishimu, is just like the Kav, is also as a result of the Tzimtzum, or else you wouldn't call it an impression, a trace. He actually gives example for it. He says, imagine having a perfume box, and a very strong perfume in there, meaning the source of the perfume, whatever it may be, coming from a certain, whatever it is. You remove the source of the perfume. In the box remains a certain scent that is left over even after you remove the perfume. So he gave that as an example to the Rishimu, that before the Tzimtzum, the perfume was there, everything was powerful. Then when the Tzimtzum concealed, so only a Rishimu, only a trace remained. So in his interpretation, it's exactly as would seem to be the base, the simple interpretation, a trace. Not the whole thing, but a trace. But the Rebbe Marash is focusing on the words of the Alter Rebbe. He says, Keilelas HaKoil. So there was a chassid, his name was Rav Dan Tumarkin, and he went into a polemic debate with the Moganovis, the Kopister, about this issue. He was defending the Rebbe Marash, Tumarkin was, and the Kopister was was disagreeing with him. Now, the Rebbe Marash himself, as you see here, Matzazu and other Maimonim discusses this more at length. But the Rebbe Rashab, of course, is a son of the Rebbe Marash, took it to another level completely in explaining it in this full-blown way, understanding that the Shema very different than it was understood before, all based on the Alter Rebbe's words, Kelelos HaKoil, but that can mean a lot of things. Kelelos HaKoil. You could also say that even the trace of the perfume, in some way, is a reminder of all the perfume. But that's not the way the Rebbe Marash and the Rebbe Rashab took it. They went the other extreme, that the Rishimu, because they wanted to come out to the point, because what's the point of having a Rishimu? The Rishimu really has everything from before the Tzimtzum in a way that the Tzimtzum did not impact it. The impact is not on the Rishimu itself. The impact is the Eir HaBligvul is concealed, so you don't see this revelation. But the letters themselves did not change. Like if you take away, let's say, as I said before, letters are lying on a table, they're covered in water. You remove the water, even though the Tzimtzum causes the water to be removed, the letters don't change. You have basically left over something that was from before the Tzimtzum. That's how the Rebbe Rashab is explaining it based on the Rebbe Marash. The Rebbe Marash goes a step further and says even more than that not only did the letters not get changed, impacted at all, there's no impact at all. It's like, I'm trying to think of an example. Okay, I'll back to the example. No impact at all, but more than that, he says, even the letter's capacity to reveal Oyer is also not impacted. Because the reason they're not revealing Oyer is not because the Oisius became damaged or became inept, is because the Oyer was removed. Some other force removed the Oyer. So the Oisius are already, they're both there and they're ready to reveal without any effect by the Tzimtzum. That's how the Rebbe Marash explains it. And the Rebbe Rashab is developing this further, especially here. So he's saying essentially like this. So clearly the Rishima then is not like the Akudim, where the energy receded and left some thickness, and then a Keli emerged. Then the Rishima existed before the Tzimtzum, Koyach HaGvul, in Ein Sof. That letters were there. However, they were completely submerged and not recognizable, not discernible. The Tzimtzum, the Oyer recedes, the Eir HaBligvul, and what happens is the Koyach HaGvul is now here, the Rishimu, completely intact. So it's not due to the Tzimtzum. The Rishimu was not a result of the Tzimtzum. The Rishimu was a force before the Tzimtzum. What's a result is that it emerges. The letters emerge. Now, what does he mean by hanichel b'shimlei noga b'tzimtzum? It looks like he's going even further by saying not only was the letters not affected, but the air within them is also not affected. Like I said before from the Rebbe Marash, because the Oisius did not get in any way compromised, they're ready to do what they have to do. So the air, because if you say the Tzimtzum did affect it, then it's not a relation from the Eir and Sef HaBligvul. So essentially he's saying that the Rishimu has two things that are intact. Its Koyach HaGvul for sure is intact, its very letters, and also its capacity to express the Eir and Sef HaBligvul is also intact. However, it's not effectively doing it right now because it's concealed. Yeah. That's what he said right here. Okay, any questions? Now's a good time to stop.
So you need the Koyach HaGvul, the Rishimu, in order, you need the Tzimtzum in order the Rishimu should have an effect to bring the Kav, because otherwise nothing will come down.
That's one aspect, but there's something more even. Let's talk Taka Ili Yitzur. If there was no tzimtzum, so the Eibishter has a koyach hagvul, it's b'shleimus lifnei tzimtzum. But b'seichel ha'adam, in our intelligence, there's no way of understanding how a gvul is going to be created, because the Eirak Blikvul is dominating. I think I should add one or 2 points that will help understand. You can make the argument, why do you need B'chlal Eirei Sef HaBlikvul? Since God wants to create a world, and the world is a structure, he wants a dira b'tachteinim, and tachteinim, as the name states, is a pluralistic multitude of details. That means tachteinim, everything in this world. Daimim, Sameach, Chai, Medaber, the billions and trillions of species, every detail, every fiber of existence. So why is there an Eirab Gvul altogether? The Eibishter doesn't have to have an Eirab Gvul. He can create Gvul. The answer is because he wants a Dira B'Tachtein. He doesn't just want Gvul. He wants that the Gvul of existence should experience the Bligvul of Elikus. Even though the Bligvul of Elikus is also not Atzmus. Atzmus is higher than Bligvul. But in Giluyim, for us, we appreciate godliness when we see God's expansiveness. So therefore, there's an Eira Bligvul, there's an Eira Gvul. In volume 1 in Ain Beis, he said the Eira Gvul creates the structure of existence. The Eira Bligvul introduces Bittul. If there was only Eira Gvul or Kecha Gvul, we wouldn't have ultimate Bittul, because Bittul requires that we are in awe and we completely are sublimated and completely nullified in the presence of something that's far greater than us. That's critical in the Aveda of making a Dira B'Tachten. So the Eira Bligvul captures the Ein Sof of Elikus, the godless Habeda. Now, that's Gilui. That's Lifnei Tzimtzum. But on the other hand, if you only had Eira Bligvul, even though within it encompassed also Keich HaGvul, like we said, the infinite possibilities also includes a finite possibility. So if you didn't have a tzimtzum, the Eira Bligvul would be dominant. All you would have is Ein Sof. So that comes the tzimtzum. The tzimtzum conceals the Eira Bligvul, allows the Keich HaGvul to now emerge. And yes, when it will interact with the Kav, it will create a world of Gvul. So you'll have both Oir and Keli, or the Sheresh Ha'er and Sheresh Ha'keli. That's a little more context in what we're discussing here. So essentially, the Rishimu is critical because it allows the Keich HaGvul to become an entity of its own, not as part of Ein Sof, and a Metzias, like he said. And at the same time, the Rishimu also, in its concentrated space, or in its concentrated Nikud, I should say, has the whole Eir Abligvul Lifnei Tzimtzum as well. He said, Ein Sof Abligvul, because Lei Nogabat Tzimtzum. Yeah. Okay, does that help?
But we have to say that the Tzimtzum is Mesalik Dem Oil Ein Sof, and then we're getting the Rishimu. So it's like
yes,
the
correct.
Tzimtzum comes. Okay.
Yeah. The thing is, the truth is, I was thinking about it a lot because he says at the end of the last paragraph, look, the see that line? What does that mean? So I've been struggling with that and trying to understand it based on what we're learning now. He says it here as well. So I'm thinking that what he's saying here is that there's two things that really cause the tzimtzum causes the concealment of the Eira Bligvul. But the Rishimu, by its very definition, is also a concealer, because that's what Keich HaGvul is. Keich HaGvul means that it's only limiting it to this particular thing. So I don't know if this is correct to say. It may be absolutely wrong, but I began thinking a machshava zara, I don't want to call it machshava zara, a thought that maybe it goes like this. Where does the Keich HaTzimtzum come from? Doesn't that come from the Keich HaGvul? So in other words, since the Eibush says a Keich HaGvul, which is Lifnei Tzimtzum, it's encompassed in the Eira Bligvul. That is the Rishimu B'Lifnei Tzimtzum. So maybe the Koyach HaGvul creates Hein Gvuresov, is what creates the restraint that causes the Tzimtzum to happen. And then the Rishimu that remains is that Koyach HaGvul, because that's what happened. The Koyach HaGvul has now dominated, and the Eira Bligvul has receded. Maybe that itself, the Koyach HaTzimtzum, is the Koyach HaRishimu. I began thinking that way, but I'm not sure that's pshat here, because there's too few words to be able to say it. I have to read it a few more times. If that's the case, then basically the Rishimu Lifnei Atzim, the Koyach HaGvul, is the power that causes the receding of the Eira Bligvul. And then there's another thing. What happens is then the Koyach HaGvul is the dominating force, because there's a few places where he says, for example, K'shahayat Tzimtzum Nase his gabras the Koyach HaGvul shebe'ein sof. You can read it two ways. That when the Tzimtzum happened, that caused the intensification of the Koyach HaGvul, which is what the Rishimu will be, which is what the Rishimu is, or K'shayat Tzimtzum Nase his gabras HaKoyach HaGvul, that the Koyach HaGvul is the gabras that causes the Tzimtzum. It doesn't sound like it when you read it plain, but I just wanted to point it out because you're reading. So I lean towards saying that it's the latter. It's not correct to say that because he's saying he wants to make the main point he wants to make is that it's not like an akudim, that the Rishimu is not a result of the absence of oir. The Rishimu is a koyach hagvul lifnei tzimtzum. I don't know if he wants to say to that extent that koyach hagvul caused the tzimtzum. But you could argue that way as well. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say here. But bottom line, I think he means to say that the Rishimu itself does not require the tzimtzum for it to do its job. It's a koyach hagvul regardless of the tzimtzum. Like he says further, that however you need to remove and recede the bligvul for the Rishimu to emerge. Then when he says because the Shim is leiping place silik with the.
Can I say something?
One
second. Let me just finish my train of thought. I'll tell you the truth. I read it again. There are parts here that seem very clear that this is the way he means to say it. I just read it again. I'm going to read it a few more times. Anyway, I put it out there. Let's discuss it. We'll see where we go. I'm going to read it a few times till I really get it. Go ahead, please.
I say something. I think maybe I'm looking at it all wrong. That the koyach hagvul is two different types of koyach hagvul. One, if you use the Rav and Talmud mashal, it's more like the Tzimtzum, and if you use the reproductive mashal, the whole man is concentrated. So it's a different concentration. One is a concentration preserving everything that's more like the Rishimu, and one is a concentration that doesn't hold everything that's more like the Rav and Talmud. Two different types of guru apply different ways.
It's possible. Are you trying to distinguish the akudim and the tzimtzum and the rishimu of the tzimtzum arishin, or you're saying in the tzimtzum arishin these two aspects?
More in the tzimtzum arishin, one type of a gevura makes the whole seder salshus chulu, and the other one is compared.
It is true.
Like shrinking, like somebody's like shrinking it down, like in reproduction, completely, but everything's intact.
Well, let's make something clear here. That there's a tzimtzum that diminishes or conceals the oil is a given. That's for sure. The question is the rishimu. What is its role in that context? In other words, the oil has to be concealed, and then afterwards comes a kav, like he said. 1 second.
This is the Tzimtzum, no?
Hold on. Yes,
The
yes,
oil.
that's yeah. The Tzimtzum is the opposite of Oir. Oir is Gilui, Tzimtzum is Hela. The Shimu is initially a Koyach HaGvul. Like I mentioned a number of times, it never was Oir in the first place. It's a Koyach HaGvul of the Eibishter. So it's not subject to Tzimtzum. As a result, it remains, the Tzimtzum allows it to emerge, like we're saying, but it is its own entity. But there's no question there's two things going on here. One is a concealment of Oir, and another is the Koyach HaGvul itself. In other words, if you put it a different way, if Eibishter only concealed his Oir, would you have the creation of Gvul? You would have a creation perhaps of Gvul as absence of light, but it would never have the power of Gvul, God's power to create real Gvul. It would just be, it's like the Gvul would only be as a result of removing everything else, so you have something left over. But here, the Rishima has become an entity of its own and is going through its own track. And the interesting thing is that it also includes Erha, just like the Erha Bligvul included the Rishima, the Koyach HaGvul, the Koyach HaGvul now is including the Erha Bligvul in it as well.
So the Tzimtzum is causing the Gilui Horishimo.
Well, the problem is you can't say Gilui Horishimo because the Rishimo is Helen. You don't mean Gilui. You mean to say that it should be able to function on its own. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
Right. And also the Rishimo itself is, like you said, is not having anything besides Koyach HaGvul, so that's why probably you need a kav after that.
Oh, for sure. That's for sure. I was looking at it on Nat. The Rebbe has here a few ha'aris. I want to just see one, if it's relevant to us. I don't think so. Okay.
Well, we learned that the Rishimo is not just Rabbi Keitel, I don't think, Koach Bull. It also has the Or Oblique Bull in the Rishimo.
That's correct. Both.
What I'm trying to understand, that Or Oblique Bull, how is it cohabitating or existing with the bull? Was there some type of shift in that bleak bull or that remains with coincidentally with the Koach bull in the Rishimu after the Tzimtzum? How does that Or Oblique Bull exist there? What wouldn't you that dominate the bull again because it's Gilui?
It's not Gilui. That's the whole point. It's Behelim.
The Oblique Bull.
That's the whole point, because before the Tzimtzum it was Begilui and the Rishima was Behelim. Now the Rishima is the dominant. The Koach HaGvul is dominant. Within it lies God's infinite possibilities. Like I said, in a grain of sand you can find God's infinity, but it's not revealed. That's the whole point. It's not revealed. In other words, it's the Kalim or the Shedeshim, the Rishimu has an infinite potency of the Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, but it's now all concentrated in the Koach HaGvul. To put in the words of Tanya, chapter 4, which I'm teaching now, he asked the question there. He says, isn't God Ein Sof, the Ein Cheker, etc., etc.? So he brings the Maimer Chazal. In the place of God's greatness, you also find his humility. So he explains, the same God that has infinite expansion can also concentrate it into Torah and mitzvahs, even though they're structured. It's the same infinity. But the infinity, one is revealed infinity, and one is infinity that is so-called concentrated, that eingekvetcht, like fit in, compacted inside. The bottom line is, like the Rebbe would always say, that you have infinite potential. How's that possible? We're finite creatures, because the Eibishter put his Ein Sof into our finite structures. In the root, that's the Rishimu. It's not affected by the Tzimtzum because the finite was there, the power of the finite. The power of the finite has within it all this infinity, but it's concealed. That's where the Avodah comes. Our Avodah is going to be by using the Kav and the Rishimu, the Eiris and Kalim, to reveal not just the iris inside the kalim, but the power of the kalim themselves that reach all the way to these highest levels. We're going to be learning this in the next few classes, exactly this point, what the ultimate goal is going to be in this. Yeah.
So you would think that in a sense, like this aura oblique bull that's concentrated and, so to speak, limited and concealed by the bull in the Rishimu, why it's like a sleeper cell that it's existing there, but it's not existing. You don't. Why would you?
We said latent, yes, sleeper, latent, dormant, whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
Why do we need the kav in the first place? Maybe the whole thing is the gilui of the Rishimu itself. Ain Od is just.
There's no gilui without the kav because the Rishimu doesn't have gilui in it. The Rishimu
has bleak bull orb, but it's concentrated.
Bleak bull, but gilui is the domain of Ur and the kav. That's like having kale. That's like having a body without a soul. There's no awareness. There's no cognizance. You can't learn Torah. You can't do a mitzvah. A keli on its own is not active. It needs a neshama. It needs Ur and kav to bring it alive. You need gilui. That's the whole point. The whole point is there's atzmus is in tachtenim, but Mashiach is not just about atzmus being in tachtenim. You want it revealed. You want to see it. You want everybody experiencing it. That's the role of the kav and the role of Ur.
So the kav is the koyach hagvul of the Rishimu is magbil them koyach or in sof. This is the kav.
No, absolutely not. No, the kav is a whole different story. The kav is a gili Ur that comes from before the tzimtzum in the form of a kav. The Rishimu is koyach hagvul. The kav is not koyach hagvul. The kav is Ur. Eragvul, erabligvul, however you interpret it, is gilui. Why are you confusing gilui and helam? Ur and a keli are two opposites. The Rishimu is the root of kelim, kav is the root of Urus. That's the whole point of departure here. Without that, the whole thing falls apart. Not sure, you're conflating. It's like neshama and guf. Why don't we just have a neshama or just a guf? Because we need these two to interact. The guf is the place where the work is done. The neshama is the one that carries the gilui of elikus in it.
So what is chazal v'heyer the kav? If it's
why don't you go back? He explained that in the top of the page in the parentheses. He asked exactly that question. What is chazal v'heyer? Read the fourth line on top of the page 1269. He explains what means chazal v'heyer. That because it's bringing back the gilui, but the gilui is in a limited form. That's
Rishimu.
That's kav.
Right? The Rishimu is making
that's kav. That's the kav. Chazar v'heyer is the kav, not the Rishimu. The Rishimu doesn't have heyer. There's no heyer.
Yeah, you understand. But the kav is shining now through the Rishimu.
No, he's not saying that here. He doesn't discuss that at all here. He's saying the kav is a kav. That's another discussion. What is the connection? Anyway, let's learn what says here pshat, and then we can try to understand it better. There's an interaction between the kav and the shima, but he's not discussed that here yet. So I'm not saying there is an interaction, but it's not what he's saying here yet. As you know, I'm trying to learn the pshat.
The Rishimu is the koyach hagvul. And the way that I understood is, why do you need it? Because the koyach hagvul itself is not an oil, so you need the kav. But the kav cannot be without the Rishimu that the koyach hagvul.
Well, you can say the kav. All the kav needs is a tzimtzum. Who says it needs the Rishimu?
So the tzimtzum is the Rishimu.
Anyway, listen. I am teaching what it says in Ain Beis here. I don't want to go further because if we don't understand what it says here, we're not going to understand other things. Whatever I taught here so far is what he says here. What you're bringing in is your own understanding from previous Maimonim and learning, which is, you're right, but it's just going to confuse matters. So I'm learning what it says here. I recommend put everything aside and just learn what he says here. And then you can start understanding how it relates to other things. He's not talking about how the kav and the shimu interact. He's distinguishing between them. This is the kav and this is the shimu. Do they interact? Yes, but he's not discussing that right now. He wants to distinguish between two different tracks and how they function differently because that's what the Rebbe Rashab is coming to explain here. If you want to know how the Kav and the Shimu interact, look in a Cholzud Anat. It's a completely different mimer. It's nothing to do with this mimer. Chapter 27, in the Rebbe's footnote there. There he talks about how the Kav and the Shimu interact. He does not discuss that here. So I'm not saying I won't discuss it, but I want to discuss it after we learn what it says here. Because if not, we will never understand what it says here. That's my role here, is to understand Ain Beis, this page, these pages that we're learning now. So far he said what we discussed about the Kav and the Shima. Okay. So again, there is plenty to say. There are many things that are said about these topics that are not the topic and theme here. So I'm focusing what he says here, okay? So we'll stop here. We're 5 lines from the bottom. V'nimtza oira reshimu is the next line.